Hello, everyone. My name is John Waterhouse, and I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning and wish you a great day. It's a pleasure this morning to introduce Karen Filowich. Karen has 25 years of educational experience as an elementary teacher, school administrator, and language arts consultant. In 2007, she completed her Master of Education degree in the area of literacy. Karen's first book as an author was How Do I Get Them to Write? It was published by Pembroke Publishers in May of 2017. Her second book, Free Writing with Purpose, was published in January of 2019. Both books are practical guides for the teaching of writing and include lists of mentor texts for each area of study. Karen continues to write and has some exciting projects in the works. Karen presents regularly for teachers on a variety of topics. She especially enjoys working with students through school-based writing residencies to demonstrate how writing can transform their work and their lives in the classroom and beyond. She also offers parent literacy evenings, providing simple, effective ways to engage children in the literacy-rich activities in the home. I hope you can join me in welcoming Karen to this session. Karen, please.
Thank you so much, John. It's very nice to be here with everyone this morning. I am obviously very passionate about the topic of language arts and literacy within our classrooms and how it impacts our students. So that is why I was very, very honored to be here today. Now, just before we officially begin, I am going to, you may have done this already in your large group session, but I am going to acknowledge that we here in Alberta are on the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have lived and gathered on these lands for centuries. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and create on this beautiful land. Now, in terms of a welcome, John has said already many of the things that I have on the slide here. So as you can see, this is an area of passion for me, so much so that I created a website entitled Words Change Worlds. I do believe in the power of words in our lives and in our students' lives. And so everything that I do tends to center around that. Now, today, our plan is going to be first just to talk about the importance of language in our world, in our lives, for ourselves and for our students, obviously, our children, obviously. And then we are going to have a look at the new curriculum itself. So I'm going to show you on the website how you can access it. We'll look at a little overview, dive in a little bit to the structure and the content. And then what I hope to do with you is to run through some of the things that you are going to expect to see in your child's classroom moving forward in the fall. And then also to highlight some of those things that you can do to help at home in the area of literacy. So when we think about the importance of language, both in our classrooms and beyond our classrooms, I think it's essential that we really consider how language impacts every moment of our lives. So I love this quote here that it says, the limits of your language are the limits of your world. And when you think about it, language impacts the way we think, the way we interact with the world, the way we interact with others. It helps us to categorize our world. And you as parents know that, when your children are learning language, that initial stage is so exhilarating, so exciting, because the language is helping them access their world. It's helping them communicate with us in a new way. So really, when we think about the power of language, it is something that is used every day of our lives more than we even realize. We're not even cognizant of how much we're using language every moment. Now, when we think about the nature of language, it does form the basis for thinking, communicating, and learning. Now, I'm going to start thinking about it now more in terms of the classroom. We know that it's present in our everyday lives, but from this point on, let's start thinking about it in our classroom environment. So it does impact our students' learning, our children's learning in so many different ways. Now, the strands of language, there are 6 interrelated strands that have been referred to in curriculums past and the current curriculum as well. And these strands are interrelated. So we have our listening and our speaking, our reading and writing, and then our viewing and representing. And when we think about how we unpack the curriculum, when we think about how we interact with our world, these strands are key. They're critical in what we do as teachers with our students, in what we do even as parents with our children. And we probably don't even realize all of that is going on in our interactions. Now, when we think about literacy, so there's a difference between language and literacy. Alberta education defines literacy as the ability, confidence, and willingness to engage with language, to acquire, construct, and communicate meaning in all aspects of daily living. Okay, so literacy is just taking that language now and putting it into practice. And so we're going to talk about how we reach that ultimate goal of literacy with our children. Because when I think about it now, maybe I'm biased because this is my area of passion, but when I think about what parents want to know, and as John mentioned, I've been a classroom teacher, I've been a school administrator, and I've been that language arts consultant. And guess what parents most often want to know? How is my child doing with their reading? Because it does impact so much else that is going to go on in their lives. And it impacts other subject areas as well, right? We know if our children struggle with reading, they're going to have more difficulty accessing those other subject areas. So it's so critical that we move towards that goal of literacy. Now, thinking about that literacy, it's going to empower our students as they move through their education. It's going to help them interact with their teachers, with their subject areas, but also beyond those four walls of our classroom, right? We are going to have our students use those skills every day of our lives. And as a classroom teacher or as a guest in classrooms, when I come in, that's one of the things I want students to realize is that, you know what, I'm not teaching this because I have to. I'm not teaching it because it's in the curriculum. I'm teaching this to you because it's going to help you interact with your world, understand your world, communicate with others every single day of your life. And when students, when they see it from that perspective, it changes things a little bit, right? I say, I'm not teaching it because there's going to be a test on this. I'm teaching it because it's going to help us in the world. And I like that premise with our students. So when we now think about this new curriculum, with language in mind, right? So thinking about it with the things that we've talked about already. If you are interested in diving into it more today, or after today's session at some point, just know that it's all accessible for you here on the Learn Alberta site. And on the left-hand side there, you can see, if you were to click on Alberta's new curriculum, kindergarten to grade 6, it's going to take you to this page here. And when you look at this page, a couple of things that I just want to point out to you. First of all, we do have all the subjects area listed, even though we only have the 3 subject areas officially being implemented this coming fall. We do have all the subjects listed as that because we know the curriculum has been in development. So if you are interested to see where it's at right now, you are certainly welcome to do so. One of the other things that I just want to point out to you here, we have literacy progressions, numeracy progressions, competency progressions. We're going to talk about those a little bit, but just notice on this page how they're sort of the foundation for everything else, right? They impact everything else. They are actually connected to all areas of study. So even literacy progressions, don't just think that's specific to language arts. It actually is something that influences all areas. The same with the others. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out on this particular page, if you were to look on that left menu, those 2 sections where I have the arrows pointing, both have information specifically for parents. So if you were to click on either of those, you're going to find a parent section, you'll find a teacher section and a parent section. And no, as parents, there are going to be some things that you don't have access to. Certain resources will appear locked to you if you were to go into the teacher side of it, but many things are here specifically for parents as well. So just to be aware of that. All right, now, if I were to click on that English language arts and literature on the previous page, it brings us here. So they have an overview for us first, and then you can go into each of the specific subject areas here. Sorry, each of the grade levels here at the bottom. From there, I just wanted to spend a moment thinking about this overview. This is very much connected to what I spoke to earlier when we're thinking about the nature of language. It mentions those 6 interrelated strands: the reading, writing, listening, speaking, viewing, and representing. It's talking about our ultimate goals within the English language arts and literature curriculum, right? So this is where we're headed with the curriculum. So that's there for you. Now, one of the things that is different with this new curriculum is even in the title change. So instead of just English language arts, which is what we had previously, they've actually added English language arts and literature. Now, does that mean literature wasn't present in your child's classroom? Of course not. It always was there, but they have highlighted it here with that title change. And the quote that you see here is actually from that previous page overview. But when I think about the power of literature in our lives, we can use literature as a teacher in so many different ways. In terms of content, it's going to be something that is important, right? So we might be using literature in our classrooms, for example, with Earth Day yesterday, reading a book about, there's a book called One Plastic Bag. Reading a book like that can spark such interesting conversation with our students. So part of that literature is going to be because of content that we're sharing. As a teacher of writing, I love using literature to help our students know what authors do. What do authors do? How can we do the same that those authors are doing? Literature has also been referred to as both mirrors and windows. So when you think about literature as, let's start with a mirror. Our children are going to see themselves reflected in the books they read, or we want them to see themselves reflected in the books they read. And so when you're thinking about the literature that your teachers are sharing with your children, they're choosing that literature very, very deliberately, right? So sometimes it is so that our children can relate to something. There are many books that have, classroom experiences that children will relate to and that they can learn from. But we can also think of literature as windows. So recently I was in a classroom where I shared a book called The Black Book of Colors, and it is about a little boy who is blind. And the book is written both in Braille and then also in, regular text that we are familiar with. But with this class, it was a grade 2 class, I talked to the students about how this book is a window into someone else's life, because all of us sitting here are sighted. It can help us to understand our world in a new way, and it brings that empathy piece as well. So I was very glad to see that they brought the literature piece maybe more directly into the curriculum itself. Like I said, it's not that it wasn't there before, but maybe now we're just highlighting it a little bit more. Now, if we're back to this home page, this is where I just wanted to point out those progressions to you. So if you were to click on the competency progressions, you are going to get a page that looks like this. And in fact, it is actually quite a few pages long. So on the left-hand side there, you can see critical thinking, problem solving, research, managing information. There's actually all of those things that you see on the text box that I've included. Now, this is one of those things that underlies the whole curriculum. So as teachers, we have to remember our ultimate goals of our teaching in our classroom. What are we trying to do with our students? Well, really, we want them to be competent, confident, capable members of society. And you can see that those skills that are listed there are going to help us to do that. So everything we do in every subject area should be working towards these competencies. The same is going to be true for our literacy progressions. Now, the way that they've divided it in all 3 of these progressions you can see you have the kindergarten, the Division 1, and the Division 2, right? So there's specific things that as teachers we're keeping in mind as we go. Literacy progressions are outlined in the section, in the little text box that you see there. So those are all things that are going to be foremost on a teacher's mind. And again, not just in a language arts classroom, but in every classroom, right? And it's going to influence our teaching in every classroom. And the same is true for numeracy. And so we really want to be aware as parents that these help teachers understand that ultimate goal and remind us of what we're trying to do so that our students can interact in their world. So even though we have those specific subject areas and the curriculum within, these are going to be guiding us as well. Now, when we're thinking about the timeline, this may be something that you've already seen. So we're here today, obviously, because we're thinking about the implementation of our English language arts, math, K-3, and then physical education and wellness is K-6 this coming fall. If you're thinking about the other subject areas, that's to come. And in a way, I'm actually glad that we're staggering it a little bit here. You know, as teachers, we really want, teachers have they really do want to do well. They have this desire to do the best that they can. And so by starting with these three, that's going to be more manageable than starting with all of them. And so I was glad to see that that decision was made. And then as time goes on, we're going to see those other subject areas implemented as well. If you have questions about that, let me know at the end and we can come back to this. Now let's have a look at the curriculum structure for English language arts and literature, because these are some of the things that you are ultimately going to see in your child's classroom and also in terms of reporting. Now, one of the things just to be aware of is that the curriculum was designed to have common features across all subject areas. This is different than it has been in the past. So in the past, language arts was designed completely differently than math and science. Each of them had their own features. So this time we do have these three features that are common. So the overall architecture and design is going to be the same. The learning outcomes, not the actual outcomes, but the fact that we have learning outcomes organized in the way that we do. And then the clear and concise language, something that the government has said, okay, here we go. This is what we're going to do in all subject areas, ultimately to make it easier for teachers going forward. Now, when we look at each subject area, it doesn't matter which one, you are going to see it organized in this way. And the spiral visual there helps us, right? So the organizing idea is going to be that big picture. We'll talk specifically about the English language arts organizing ideas today. Underneath that, we have our guiding questions, our learning outcomes, which from a parent perspective is what you are going to see most of. Okay, then underneath that, we have knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures. That's all the little details that I'll show you. And then you'll notice that the competencies, the literacy, numeracy progressions are underneath that as well. So this architecture and design would fit for any curricular area. Now, when we look at what it looks like in the curriculum itself, this is what a teacher is going to see. So, well, this is what you are going to see also if you dive into the curriculum, but this is how a teacher is going to plan. Okay, so they have their organizing idea, guiding question, learning outcome, and then you can see at the very bottom there, the knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures. I personally, I like the visuals of this digital format, but I am so old school in many ways. I'm a print person, and just the way my brain works, I also like that they have a print version of this. So if you go back to this screen, if you like, navigating through the digital form, then you certainly can. You can go through there. I personally find it easier sometimes to look at that printable curriculum if I want to see everything at once. I use both, I like both, but this one I find for me works, but it has the same features, just to realize that the organizing features, the guiding questions, their learning outcomes, and then what we're going to start calling cusps, the knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures. That's the nickname they have given it, cusps. Obviously they're still present whichever version that you happen to be looking at. So if you're interested in looking through the specifics, you certainly can. Now let's just talk about each of these areas very, very briefly. The organizing idea is that big idea that's going to span all grade levels. So this is actually going to be, when you look from K-6, even though we're only implementing K-3 right now, the organizing ideas are going to span right across those grade levels. The guiding questions are going to be different at each grade level. Obviously, the learning outcomes are going to be different at each grade level as well. The guiding questions may be something that you see posted in your child's classroom. That could be something teachers use, not necessarily, but some teachers might do that. And so that might be something that you encounter as well. Now, when we look at the nitty gritty, so like I said, you're going to see the learning outcomes, and I'm actually going to share those with you today. But under those, teachers have dozens and dozens of what we're calling cusps, just for ease, instead of saying knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures each time. Now, what you see here, this is just one little snapshot, but under each learning outcome, there's actually many, many, many of these that teachers are going to have to go through. So when we think about the difference between them, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just so that you have that understanding of how it's approached. The knowledge is something that students need to know in order to do anything else. Okay, so it's that foundation to the understanding, to the skills and the procedures. So listed, you'll often find that the knowledge is actually going to have the most individual little items there, because there's some of that foundational knowledge that students need to know. When you think about understanding, it's putting those pieces of knowledge together. Like, what good is it to know that knowledge if we don't now think about how it relates to our world, right? So it's a little bit more complex than the knowledge in and of itself. And so we're thinking now about context, we're thinking about that kind of thing. And you can just, skimming that example there gives you an idea of that. From there, though, we don't want to stop there. We want to make sure that our students are able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding. So these skills and procedures, to me, are so critical, because what's the point of knowing something or understanding something if we can't then apply it in our world? So we really need, as teachers planning, we're thinking about all three. And, I'm making it sound quite simplistic in terms of a linear process, but really that knowledge is foundational if we're going to move forward. So we might not approach it systematically as I've just described. It might be much more interrelated, but you can see kind of how one leads to the other. Now, when we're thinking about these organizing ideas, to me, this is where I thought it would be important to go as parents today. So these are the 9. Now you see 9 listed there. I said that they're the same for every grade level. The exceptions would be the 3 in the middle. So phonological awareness, we only focus on in kindergarten to grade 2. Phonics is kindergarten to grade 3, and fluency kindergarten to grade 4. The others that don't have grade levels written next to them are going to be kindergarten to grade 6, right? And what we're going to do is just take a little dive into each of these to think about what they are and how they're going to look in your child's classroom. Now, I put this graphic here just to emphasize the interrelatedness of all of these. Now, for the purpose of the curriculum, as I mentioned, the structure is the same from subject to subject. So they did organize it in organizing ideas, not only in language arts, but in other subject areas as well. So they're organized in that way. But when I'm working with teachers, one of the things that I'm going to emphasize is the interrelation between these things, because I always, joke when I'm giving a session on writing to teachers. I say, I can't talk writing without talking reading, without talking the vocabulary piece, without talking the oral language piece. They're so interrelated. So we might have a focus, but that doesn't mean these skills are isolated from each other. In fact, not at all. That's the nature of language, is that they are interrelated. So for me as an educator and working with educators, that's one of the points that I am absolutely going to emphasize. I understand why the curriculum was designed this way, to echo the other subject areas, but as teachers, we can't forget that connectedness between. Now, let's have a look at each of those organizing ideas just to understand what they all mean. And I'm just checking on time here. So when we think about text forms and structures, this is the way that it's described in the curriculum for all grade levels. And I'll just give you a moment to read that. One of the things to realize is that when we're thinking about text forms and structures, sometimes we assume that that means print text only, and just be aware that it's not only print. So when we're thinking about those strands, we're thinking about viewing and representing, for example, text is actually, can be video, it can be advertising, it can come in many different forms. And in the digital age, that's one of the things that we have to recognize as well, is that our children are interacting with text of very many different forms, and some forms that we might not even be familiar with. So we really have to make sure that we're helping our children to understand these different forms. Because when I think about this, when I read this, what I realize is, yes, it's going to impact their comprehension, but to me, it also impacts their writing as well, because we're going to write for different forms. So the learning outcomes, as I mentioned before, this is probably what you are going to see as parents. It has been stipulated that the learning outcomes are what we are going to report and assess on. I'll say it the other way, assess and report on to parents. So in kindergarten, the learning outcome, there's one outcome for text forms and structures. And then remember, all those cusps are underneath. Now, those individual cusps, you probably won't see, is my guess, but you will see this. Children explore how messages can be organized. Grade 1, you can see we're building in complexity. Students examine ways that messages can be organized and presented for different purposes. And obviously for grade 2 and 3, we're also building in complexity. So these learning outcomes are guiding our teachers, guiding their instruction with their students for this particular organizing idea. And all those cusps are underneath of it. Ultimately, though, this is what we're working towards, if that makes sense. Now, the second organizing idea is oral language. I'll let you read that. And then the learning outcomes that are associated. So when I'm thinking about this from a teacher perspective, again, I'm just remembering that really this can't happen in isolation, right? And that oral language piece, notice sometimes we assume that it just means the speaking, but the listening is just as important as the speaking. And so those are things that we're going to think about, okay, what is that going to look like in my classroom, right? The third organizing idea is vocabulary. And the associated learning outcomes. Now, if you think about what, the structure that I'm presenting with you here, you may be thinking, well, wasn't this in the other curriculum? And yes, these things obviously were in the previous curriculum. We've organized it differently, but they were certainly there. One of the things that you may notice starting in grade 2 and 3 there is the word morphemes. This is something that I have taught for many years with my students, and I believe very, very much in this idea. I'm not a teacher who has traditionally used spelling tests in my classroom, but if I have used spelling tests, I'm very, very deliberate. And what I do is I think about common morphemes. What is a morpheme? It's actually just the smallest unit of meaning within a word. So an example of that would be a prefix. If I teach students a prefix, I attach the meaning to it. In fact, I get them to attach the meaning. So we might generate a list of words that all start with the prefix re, for example. So review, rewind, rerun, renew, revise, all of those different things. And then I get them to figure out, okay, well, what do you think re means? Because guess what? It means the same thing in all of those words. And when they can identify the meaning of that, just think about how powerful that is connecting to their reading. It's going to help their comprehension ultimately, but it's also going to help them when they're writing, when they start realizing that these word parts have meaning. So I was glad to see that it's more explicit, let's say, in this particular curriculum here. It's something that I've used for years and years and years, but that's something that is going to guide teachers here as well. I could talk all day about each of these things, and so I certainly won't, but it's something that I feel very passionately about. Now, phonological awareness, I mentioned earlier, is only going to be in grades kindergarten to grade 2. Now, foundational literacy is supported by the ability to identify and manipulate sounds in oral language. The next slide is going to talk about phonics. The big difference between the two, and this may be a term that is not familiar to you. It's not a term that has been used widely necessarily, but phonological awareness is oral only, the sounds only. When we bring phonics into the mix, that's when we attach the letters. Okay, so it's the print text as well. That's the difference between the two. So when you think about what's happening in our kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2 classrooms, obviously this is important, right? So no matter what I'm doing with my students, you're going to hear, you might hear a teacher say, and you probably say it yourself when your children are trying to write something, well, what sound do you hear? Well, first, we're identifying those sounds. That's what it's going to be. It's identifying them. It's being able to eventually manipulate them. One of the best things, we're going to talk about a little bit later, but one of the best things you can do as parents is rhyming games. Though that is a manipulation of sounds in oral language. Also thinking about, what do you hear at the end of that word? That's all phonological awareness. Now, what this curriculum does is it really highlights this area. It's very, very explicit in this curriculum. And in fact, it goes through specifics that teachers are going to cover in each of those grade levels that you see there. And so it is an important foundational piece. It's, again, not that it wasn't present in the other curriculum, but it's much more deliberate in this particular one. Now, as I said, the phonics takes those sounds one step further now and attaches the letters to them. Both are so important. But if we have that oral language piece first, it's going to then help with the phonics area. So this is in kindergarten to grade 3. We no longer have it in, sorry, I shouldn't say we no longer. It's not a focus in grades 4 to 6. It never really was. But one of the things, as someone who educates educators, one of the things that I was always reminding teachers is that there are going to be some students who need that emphasis on phonics still. And part of that also is bringing that morphology piece, the morphemes that I mentioned earlier, into the mix. Right. So it's not that we're going to stop just because it's out of the curriculum. We're going to do it as needed. But this is where we have the explicit teaching of the phonics. Now, fluency is going to be in the kindergarten to grade 4 curriculum. And I'll give you a moment to read the definition there. One of the ways to think about fluency is sort of to think about the opposite. If you've ever heard your child or another child read, and they're reading what we say word to word, where they're sounding out each individual word, it's very hard to comprehend if you're reading word to word. By the time you get to the 5th word, you forget what you've already read, right? So fluency is something that we need to work on because it does connect to that comprehension piece very much. So we're building towards that automaticity is what we're doing. Comprehension. I think most of us have a good understanding of what we mean when we say comprehension, but you'll notice that, context is so important, right? And when we say that text comprehension, we're not just talking about printed text. It's going to, refer to text of all types. And when I think about this digital world and I see some of the things that our children are exposed to, we really want them to be able to comprehend, okay, this is an advertisement. They're using persuasive language to try to convince you that you need this, toy or whatever it is. And that's part of comprehension in my mind is really making sure that we have that understanding across a variety of situations and the learning outcomes associated. If we were from the teacher's perspective, looking at all the specific cusps underneath that, it's very, very detailed and specific. The writing piece, my personal passion, and to me, this really does empower our children as they move through the world, right? So thinking about the author's craft and recognizing, one of my favorite questions to ask a group of students is, do you think the author did this on purpose? And almost inevitably, the first time I ask that question to a class, they say no. And what I want them to realize is that, yes, an author did this on purpose. Well, why? What is it? How can we, what, maybe it was for clarity, maybe it was for creativity or a way to express themselves. But what we do want our students to realize is that we can make deliberate decisions about our writing. If that author can do it, so can I. And so we really want to empower our students in the area of writing. The last section that we have here is conventions. So it is obviously connected to that writing piece, but thinking about, you know, those the nitty gritty. So this is where the editing comes in when we're thinking about the grammatical, the spelling, the punctuation, those kinds of things, and how it communicates, how it helps us to communicate with others. So that is a quick run through then of those 9 organizing ideas. Remember that 3 of them are going to not necessarily run right to grade 6, but those are what you would expect to see. Those learning outcomes are what you will expect to see reported on in your child's classroom. So when we're thinking about that now, here's what I want to talk about is the difference between curriculum and pedagogy. Now, these might be terms that you really haven't compared or thought about in any depth, but really just to understand that curriculum is the what. So that's what we just went through, right? And for teachers, the what is going to be all those individual cusps that we saw. Here's the difference between pedagogy. This is the how. Not all teachers are going to teach that curriculum in the same way. And that's this curriculum or any curriculum. We do want to have that individual, you rely on your strengths as a teacher. Ultimately, the goal is to bring students to a deep understanding of the content. We want them to be able to transfer. That's where that literacy piece comes in, right? The ability to manipulate and use language and interact with language so that we can interact with our world. So our goals, our ultimate goals are the same, but just remember that the pedagogy might be different from one teacher to another. Research also guides that pedagogy, right? Knowing, I've studied, I know what works when we're teaching language to students. And so those things are going to really influence the way that I bring curriculum into my classroom. Now think about this. When you're thinking about your child's classroom next year, big surprise, some things are not going to change or not going to change. They're going to be the same. There are many practices that are actually going to remain the same. You are still going to see reading in many forms. So the teachers are going to be reading aloud. They're going to have their students involved in independent reading, shared reading, guided reading, home reading. That's not going to change. That still needs to be there. They're going to be exposed to a variety of text types. That's already happening, but you can see from what we talked about, obviously it's going to continue to happen going forward. Writing in many different forms and for a variety of purposes, that's not going to change. Word work, word study, however we want to talk about it, it's going to be there. It already was in some form. It's going to continue to be there. And those opportunities for talk and collaboration. Now, when I think about what you see on the screen here, I think that this is good pedagogy. This is what should be happening in our classrooms because we know that it works. So the way we approach things might be slightly different from teacher to teacher. That curriculum is the same. I know I need to teach these things, but how I go about it is going to be influenced by that research by the students sitting in front of me, by what I know about language learning. Right? All those theories. Now, what might be somewhat different is that you might see more of an emphasis on word parts. So even the terms, phonological awareness, phonics, morphology, that those terms have been made more explicit in this curriculum. You might see a change. Now, it depends on the teacher. Some teachers were already doing this very explicitly to begin with. So depending on your child's teacher, you may see a change or you may not. Now, phonics, I didn't touch too much on it then, but phonics is one of those things that has been that pendulum that swings back and forth when we think about over the years in language learning and language arts, right? Where does phonics fall? Now, what we want to realize is that phonics is one strategy. I believe that phonics should be part of the curriculum, yes. Is it the end all and the be all? No. Do we need to bring in rich literature? Do we need to expose our children to a variety of texts? Yes. yes, right? That has to be there too. So phonics is not the end all and the be all. And the one thing that we will consider about phonics going forward is that it probably won't look the same as it did 10, 15, 20 years ago. Phonics previously was very much worksheet based. And we really want to avoid that. We want to avoid the tendency to give our students those worksheets, because the research has shown that that's not where the most effective learning takes place. So there are many ways to bring the phonics into the classroom without those worksheets. Now, will there be some? Probably, but just that it's not dependent on those worksheets themselves. So keep that in mind. You're going to see phonics in some form, but it may not look the way that you have been aware of it. Now, you're probably aware, if you're the parent of a primary student, you think about the students, the books that are brought home for home reading are probably leveled text. They're often leveled text. Now, one of the things that may change, and a term that you may start to hear more of, is decodable text, especially if we're thinking about probably most in grade 1. Possibly kindergarten, possibly grade 2, but grade 1 definitely. Now, when we think about decodable text, here's the difference between a decodable text and a leveled text. If you think about those leveled texts, unfortunately, leveled text, just by their very nature, they're not particularly engaging, right? That's one of the reasons when I'm talking to teachers or parents, even in a literacy session that I give, we always want to say, we still need to be reading to our children good quality literature, because those leveled texts, let's be honest, they're very patterned based, right? Those leveled texts are going to involve words that our students are going to just have to memorize, because they're not what we call decodable. They don't follow the rules of English. So even if you think about the word the does not follow the rule of English whatsoever. So TH, we teach our students, TH together says th. And then the E, the short E says eh. Well, that's not what the creates, right? And so there's so many words like that in our English language. What decodable texts do is they provide text to our children that are phonetic. So most of the words, there's going to be a few exceptions just to make sure that it's understandable and comprehensible, but most of the words follow the phonetic rules and they happen in a scope and sequence. So decodables are not used for a long period of time. Notice that I said primarily in grade 1 for a reason, because that follows the developmental stages of our children's learning. They are to build that confidence with our beginning readers. So that may be something that you begin to see in your classroom or hear about in your classroom. That's simply what it means. So we're going to avoid, in decodable text, we're going to avoid words that don't follow those rules, except maybe some high frequency ones, like I said, the, to, like those are going to be ones that will be included just to make sure that the books make sense. Now, oral language in the new curriculum is much more formal. So this also may be a change that you see. Now, in thinking about this, there are outcomes related to sort of presentation style, where students have to memorize something or present it or recite it. That kind of thing is present more so in this new curriculum. Now, one of the things that I provided feedback to the government about when I saw the draft is that I want more of an emphasis on the oral language in terms of how we use language to learn. Well, one of the things that has dawned on me as I'm thinking about it is, you know what, that's not going to change. That's my pedagogy. So for example, if I'm reading out loud to a group of students, while I'm reading aloud, lots of things are at play there. That's what good pedagogy is. It's not just about reading aloud. I might be using think aloud strategies as I do. I'm encouraging students to use some of their comprehension strategies as I'm reading aloud. But the other piece to that is the oral language. We know that we learn by articulating what we're thinking. So oral language, even though it may appear more formal in the curriculum itself, a good teacher is going to say, yes, but I also know that part of my pedagogy is having students articulate. So when I'm teaching teachers, we talk about class discussions, yes, can be powerful, but In a class discussion, we may only have 3 or 4 students who dominate that conversation. We don't have everyone necessarily sharing. Good classroom pedagogy tells us, let's give everyone the opportunity to talk. So that's where we might do a think, pair, share, or a turn and talk. Everyone has an opportunity to articulate their thinking, articulate their learning. That's good pedagogy. So will that oral language piece, even though it's not necessarily a curriculum outcome, will it still be in your child's class? Yes, because that's good pedagogy. The oral language piece that you might see that you haven't seen before, especially with those younger ones, is that they might be expected to present something maybe more formally than they have before. So you can just be aware of that. Now, to end off today, I just wanted to talk about how you can help at home. And obviously, you know, this is a passion of mine. And when I'm thinking about what parents can do at home, to me, it's so critical to think about that language piece. You do it already, but we can even be more deliberate about it. I'm just going to give you an opportunity to read this quote by Mem Fox. This quote is from a book that has actually been around for quite some time called Reading Magic by Mem Fox. And the whole book is about reading aloud. And it's called Why Reading, or the subtitle, Why Reading Aloud to Our Children Will Change Their Lives Forever. And I wholeheartedly agree with Mem Fox. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here, the reason I chose this particular quote is because I truly believe that when we're thinking about learning, learning is tied to emotion. And so as parents, we have this wonderful opportunity. We already have an emotional connection with our children. And so when we think about the joy that can be found by reading together, all the things that can happen in those moments when we are reading together, beyond what we even can imagine. Now, you may recognize the name Mem Fox. She is the author of many, many books for children. I have a few of them here that you just might be familiar with. If that name was familiar, that's probably why. Now, I love quotes, obviously, but the greatest gift is a passion for reading. Think about how it's going to impact your children in everything they do, right? We know our children are going to be reading throughout their lives, whatever their chosen career. And so why not help provide that passion for them? I often get this question, and so I thought I'd address it today. Once my child becomes a reader themselves, should I still be reading out loud to them? And the answer is wholeheartedly yes. We really want to ensure that our children are hearing effective reading always, right? And so that's one of the benefits of reading aloud to them. But I also want you to consider when your children are beginning readers, the types of texts they're reading are going to be much more simplistic. So when we read aloud to them, we're giving them access to a wide variety of things, which they cannot yet access on their own. So continue to read aloud, whether we do that through the bedtime routines. Those shared experiences are so powerful in so many ways. When we think about it in terms of the language piece, obviously they're listening to good reading, they're starting to realize that the print holds meaning depending on what stage they're at, right? They're starting to make those phonological and phonics connections, vocabulary is being expanded. Like it really does impact so much of that literacy piece. And then think about the relationships that you're building during that time as well, right? That's just as important. When you're reading with your children, keep it a positive experience. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but one of the things that I have noticed is that sometimes we have, children who are struggling to read, they become turned off from reading quickly. So if you notice that your child is struggling, that's a conversation to have with the teacher, separate from the child, obviously, but keep that experience with reading at home positive. What we don't want is someone to be turned off of reading and not even want to attempt it. And I've seen that happen with children who struggle, right? So at least if they can still have the fun with the read alouds, they're going to be more excited, more apt to keep trying with that reading, even if it's difficult for them. And then think about your child's interests. So we do want to expose them to all sorts of different things. So maybe your particular child isn't interested in, the traditional picture books maybe that you've read. But there are so many different genres that you can experiment with. And there are hilarious picture books that our most reluctant readers will become engaged with, right? So that's one of the things that we want to do is really tap into those different genres. And the library is such a great way to do it because it doesn't involve that expense. I mean, books, let's face it, are expensive, right? So thinking about investing either the money in the books or the time to go to the library to be able to expose them, because it makes such a huge difference. Like, sadly, I have to say, I can tell in a classroom those children who have those reading experiences at home and those who don't. And that's, quite amazing to think about, but it is quite obvious who has those conversations around books and who doesn't. So while you're reading, make sure that you're having those conversations too, not officially as a teacher, but just very naturally making those predictions with your children, talking about the book throughout the book. What would you do if you were that character? What would you do? And just making it interesting for them, as interesting as you possibly can. And the connections that we can make through text. As I mentioned before, we see some books as mirrors and some as windows. So thinking about, starting to have conversations about what it reminds you of, or this is very different than what I've experienced, right? That can be part of what you're discussing. And then also that attention to the print and the pictures. Now, parents have often asked me, should I be pointing to the words on the page? And I would say sometimes, sometimes I just start on a page. Depending on what level your child is at, what age they're at, some of them haven't yet realized that those words on the page hold meaning. And so that helps when we're starting to attend to that. Then when we're attending to that for our beginning readers, they might even start to join in with you. How wonderful is that, right? That they might want to contribute in that way. So in terms of writing at home, one of the things that I would say is no official assignments. Again, just like the reading, we want to keep it fun as much as possible. One of the things that I have always done in my home is I've provided those materials. So make sure that there's opportunities to write as your children are growing. And, with our little ones, it's magnetic letters on their fridge. That could be the first writing experience that they have. But then, having a little center, a little table for them, a little craft center, whatever it is, where you include things that they could use for writing. Post-it notes. It's amazing how Post-it notes are such an engaging way for our students our children to want to write. Envelopes, those envelopes you get from all those organizations that want you to donate. And I donate everything online these days, but I save those envelopes for the little ones in my life to use when they are so inclined to write something. And, you provide those materials, see what happens. And then finally, you model and encourage that writing for authentic purposes. So all of these things are going to influence the way your child views literacy. And it makes a teacher's life so much easier when we have positive experiences surrounding literacy, whether it be in the home or what have you. And finally, just to end off here, just have fun with language, right? So thinking about those rhymes, something as simple as a sentence like this, gets those little ones giggling. And yet there's so much at work there that we don't even realize. They're attending to the sounds in a way that we might not even realize. Word games, there's so many different word games that we can play, board games that use language, all of those things. We think about, just being a little bit more intentional about choosing these kinds of activities will help our children's literacy. I always like to leave notes around. So it could be in the lunch kit when they open the lunch kit. It might be in the bathroom mirror in the morning, whatever it is. But think about that as an opportunity for reading for an authentic purpose, right? They're very motivated to read when mom or dad or grandma has written them a note. And then recipes is a fun way. And I guarantee you that in the math session that's going on at the same time, Tammy's talking about recipes in terms of the numeracy piece as well. So really, all of these things are going to support our children's learning. So to conclude, behind every young child who believes in himself is a parent who believed first. I am always impressed when I think about the fact that you're giving up your weekend as parents to be, to be part of this. You obviously care very much about your children. And I thank you for that. I thank you for taking the time today to learn about this new curriculum, to learn about what you can do in your home to help support that curriculum implementation as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with me today. I will open it up. I haven't had the chat open, so I'll open it up to see if there's anything there. And also if there's any questions that you might have, feel free to come on camera.
Mark, please.
Was there, with your expertise, was there many concerns that you had for this curriculum in terms of literacy? Like, this is one of the few places I've actually heard a teacher say that they were encouraged by some of what is here. I guess what has been your thoughts on about where it's at with literacy?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is always important to remember whenever there's a new curriculum, and any curriculum that I've experienced, there are going to be things that I like and things that I wish were there, right? That's always going to be the case. So once it was released, I looked at it with my eyes, because I have that perspective, and there were lots of things that I really did like about it, like the emphasis now on the phonological awareness and the phonics, and that being brought maybe more explicitly in was very positive, right? There were some concerns that I had, and I did express them to the government in the curriculum engagement sessions. Even I responded on the website, that kind of thing. There were pieces that I thought either weren't developmentally in appropriate maybe at that point, or things that I thought, like I said, were missing, or just maybe the emphasis. So I did have that opportunity to share, and the draft, the latest version that has come out, has addressed some of those things. Do I completely agree? Not necessarily, but here's the way that I look at it, is that pedagogy is critical. We know, right? We know what works with children in our classroom. So because the curriculum is the what, as a teacher, I'm deciding on that how based on what I know about how the way children learn and the way children learn language specifically. And so, like I said, with the oral language piece, when I looked at the curriculum and I thought, okay, well, there is really a heavy emphasis on that presentation. That's not the direction necessarily I would have gone. But what I also remember is good pedagogy is the oral language piece. Good pedagogy reminds me that I can get my students to articulate their thinking regularly in my classroom. And I do that. I don't have to take that away. So even though there's not an outcome necessarily related to it, what I've started to realize is that pedagogy is just going to be critical moving forward. And I look at new curriculum always as an opportunity. In my role, when I work with teachers, it's an opportunity for conversation. It's an opportunity to look at our practice and say, okay, here's what we have to teach. Now let's think about how we're going to be able to do this in a way that is going to benefit our students as best we can, because ultimately that's our goal. So did I agree with it entirely? No, but I don't think I ever would. I don't think anybody ever would. And so it's looking at it maybe with those eyes and say, okay, here's what we've got. Now what are we going to do about it? Does that make sense?
Karen, you've been asked if you can go back to the overview slide, and then I see Amanda's hand, and there's one more question from Becky.
Which slide? The overview in terms of?
I believe the curriculum overview.
Here, I'm just going to do something to make it easier here.
And we will have to shut things down pretty quick. I appreciate this. So Amanda, I see your hand up, and I see one more question.
Amanda, why don't you go ahead while I'm finding the slide? And Blaine, when you see which one you're hoping for, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be doing it this way, but.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. It seems as though your presentation is very positive towards the new curriculum, which is nice to hear, seeing as I think we've all been hearing a lot of the negatives. My concern is, how are they going to provide the teachers resources from here on? Because from what we understood, that wasn't something that has been developed yet through the curriculum. And will you be a part of that, or do you know
Right.
sort of who is advocating towards that?
Yes. So one of the things, and I'm conscious of time too, one of the things to realize is that so many of our resources can still be used in language arts. Now, I'm speaking specifically to language arts, okay? So we use mentor text, we use picture books, we use all of those things that can still be used. The one piece that might be missing here a little bit is the new approach to phonics and phonological awareness, but I do know that there are things in the works in that regard. And we can also, some of that is going to be, those of us in the roles like I'm in, helping teachers with those kinds of things. But the good news about it is that in language arts, so many of those things can be used, which we're, already using. I'm sorry, I'm missing questions in the chat. There's anyone else want to come on? Someone else's hand is raised.
Actually, I think there's two. There's, what are your thoughts about cursive writing? And then Risha, if you could, we'll give you a chance next, please. So cursive writing, should that be included? I have teenagers that can't read cursive writing.
Yeah, I have such mixed feelings about cursive writing. I mean, it's sad in a way that it's gone by the wayside. And yet when we think about our world and where things are headed, and with the digital focus, I can understand why it's not so much of an emphasis anymore. But it is something that our brains work very differently when we're thinking about even writing by hand compared to typing. And that's something as a teacher that I always try to bring into the classroom as well. But it's one of those things that it's not a quick, easy answer, unfortunately.
Yeah. So Risha, please, your question, and it will be the last. It might be a yes or no answer.
Oh, well, hopefully I can make it quick.
Yeah.
My question was for the older grades, like say for the grade 2s and the grade 3s that are coming in next year. What is that going to look like for them as far as what they've learned so far compared to what this new curriculum is going to give to them?
That's a fantastic question. So in language arts, remember that it's not that your teachers weren't teaching them that phonics piece or the phonological awareness piece. They were already learning that. It maybe wasn't as systematic and explicit in terms of what was expected, but they were already learning it. And so they're going to have that foundational piece. And as a teacher, if I noticed a gap that, okay, you know what, and this could be anytime, not just with new curriculum, if my students don't have this piece of the puzzle, then that's my job. They need this piece before we can do the next piece. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
I'm sorry that I'm very, very quick here, just cognizant of time.
Yeah.
If you have questions going forward, and I understand that there's maybe a lot of things, please feel free. My website is wordschangeworlds.ca. You can certainly reach out to me there. There's a contact form there. You can reach out to me with any questions that you might have. I invite you to do that.
Yeah. So Karen, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, and really appreciate everybody being here. And again, this is a 1-hour presentation. More questions can be asked, more answers can be given. And through ERLC, through Karen's website, we're working on all of these things to make it as successful as we can for all of our children. So thank you, everybody else, or pardon me, everybody. We'll close this session and get ready for the next one, the keynote. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.